The glass towers of Manhattan gleamed under the late afternoon sun, reflecting ambition, power, and ruthless efficiency. At the center of this steel jungle stood Kennedy Tower, the 60-story headquarters of Archer Dynamics, one of the world's premier luxury aerospace technology companies. Inside the executive suite on the top floor, Vivian Archer stood perfectly still, her reflection sharp in the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the private airfield below. At 31, Vivian had inherited more than just a company. She'd inherited expectations, grief wrapped in corporate bylaws, and a reputation for being as cold as the stratosphere her jets routinely pierced. Her dark suits were always tailored to perfection, her hair pulled back so tightly it might as well have been armor, and her expression rarely betrayed anything beyond calculated control. She'd built her life on a single principle: emotion is turbulence, and she would always stay above it. Today, however, the turbulence was unavoidable. But before we take off into this incredible journey, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this remind us that the people we overlook might just be the heroes we need most. Her assistant Marcus burst through the double doors, tablet clutched in trembling hands, face flushed with panic. Behind him came two other staff members, all speaking at once in urgent, overlapping voices that made Vivian's jaw tighten. "Miss Archer, Captain Reynolds collapsed in the crew lounge. They're taking him to Mount Sinai now. Heart arrhythmia, they think. He's stable, but he definitely cannot fly today." Vivian's eyes didn't leave the airfield, where her private Gulfstream G650 sat fueled and ready on the tarmac. The Boston meeting. The investors who'd flown in specifically to meet face to face. The $2 billion contract that hinged on her presence, her pitch, her control of the room. Virtual wouldn't cut it. These were old-school aviation tycoons who valued the handshake, the eye contact, the subtle power plays that only happened in person. "Get me another pilot," she said, her voice flat and absolute. Marcus's fingers flew across his tablet. "Already on it. But Miss Archer, every certified jet pilot in the tri-state area is either booked, in the air, or unreachable. It's the worst possible timing." The other assistants chimed in with increasingly desperate alternatives. Charter another jet. Reschedule. Drive to Boston. Each suggestion more ridiculous than the last. Vivian's fingers drummed once against the glass. The only outward sign of the fury building inside her carefully maintained composure. "Unacceptable," she said quietly. "I have exactly 90 minutes to be wheels. Up or we lose the entire deal. Figure it out." Below, on the tarmac, she could see maintenance crews moving around the aircraft, performing final checks, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding above them. Her gaze fixed on one figure in particular, a man in gray coveralls, methodically cleaning the exterior windows of the jet with slow, deliberate strokes. Something about his movements was different from the others, precise, almost ritualistic. If you're already hooked by this story of hidden identities and second chances, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these incredible tales of redemption and unexpected love. Drop a comment below telling us what you think Vivian should do. Now, let's see how this impossible situation unfolds. The assistants were still scrambling, making calls, checking databases, their panic rising with each failed attempt. Vivian turned from the window, ready to make an impossible decision. When the conference room door opened one more time, the man from the tarmac stood there, still holding a cleaning rag in one hand and a wrench in the other. His gray coveralls had an oil smudge across the chest, and his dark hair was slightly disheveled from working outside. But his eyes were steady, calm, like deep water undisturbed by wind. "I can fly it," he said simply. The room fell silent. Then Marcus let out a short, incredulous laugh. The other assistants exchanged glances that mixed disbelief with second-hand embarrassment. One of them actually checked the man's badge. "Elias Grant, night maintenance," she read aloud, as if the absurdity needed to be spoken to be believed. Vivian studied him. Mid-30s, she estimated. Weathered hands that spoke of manual labor. Quiet confidence that seemed out of place for someone who cleaned hangars for a living. His expression didn't change under her scrutiny. No nervousness. No desperation for approval. Just that same unwavering calm. "You're a janitor," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut. I am, Elias replied evenly. And you think you can fly a $70 million aircraft? I know I can. Someone in the room actually snorted. Marcus stepped forward, ready to escort this delusional maintenance worker out before he wasted any more of their time. But Vivian raised one hand. Something about this man intrigued her. Maybe it was the desperation of her situation. Maybe it was the way he stood there without flinching under her coldest stare. Or maybe it was that, underneath all her carefully constructed control, some part of her recognized something in him she couldn't quite name. This isn't a Cessna, she said, testing him. It's a Gulfstream G650, twin Rolls-Royce engines, fly-by-wire controls, cruising altitude 41,000 feet. Most pilots need extensive training just to taxi it. I'm aware, Elias said. Vivian's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like the expression of a person about to watch someone else fail spectacularly. The sheer audacity of this janitor, this nobody, thinking he could simply walk in and solve her problem, was almost entertaining. In a different situation, she might have had security remove him. But today, with the clock ticking and options evaporating, she felt something reckless stir inside her. Tell you what, she said, her voice dripping with cold amusement. Fly this jet and get me to Boston on time, and I'll marry you. Her assistants froze. Marcus's mouth actually fell open. The absurdity of the statement hung in the air like a challenge, like a dare, like the kind of thing a desperate billionaire says to a delusional janitor to highlight exactly how impossible his claim is. Elias didn't laugh, didn't smile, didn't react at all except for the slightest shift in his posture, a straightening of his shoulders that somehow made him seem taller. Deal, he said, and that's when Vivian realized this man was either completely insane or hiding something extraordinary. Against every logical instinct, against the protests of her staff, against her own better judgment, she made a decision that would change everything. Get him clearance, she told Marcus. We leave in 15 minutes. The walk to the aircraft felt surreal. Vivian's heels clicked against the tarmac with their usual authority, but internally she was questioning whether desperation had finally made her reckless. Behind her, Elias walked with a quiet certainty that somehow made the absurdity of the situation feel less absurd. He'd changed into a borrowed flight suit that was slightly too large, but he wore it like he'd worn 1,000 before. At the aircraft stairs, her head of security pulled her aside. Miss Archer, this is insane. We haven't vetted this man. We don't even know if he has a pilot's license. Then I guess we'll find out in the next 2 hours, she replied, climbing aboard. The interior of the Gulfstream was exactly as she'd specified when she'd custom ordered it 3 years ago. Cream leather seats, burled walnut accents, technology seamlessly integrated into elegant design, everything in its place, everything controlled. She took her usual seat in the main cabin and watched through the open cockpit door as Elias settled into the captain's chair. His hands moved across the controls with practiced familiarity. Pre-flight checks executed in perfect sequence. Switch positions verified. Systems coming online with soft chimes and glowing indicators. He moved like someone who'd done this not dozens but hundreds of times, each motion economical and precise. Vivian found herself leaning forward, watching him with an intensity she usually reserved for contract negotiations. The engines spooled up with their characteristic Rolls-Royce purr. Elias's voice came through the cabin speakers, calm and professional, nothing like the janitor who'd stood in her conference room 20 minutes ago. Tower, this is Archer. One requesting clearance for departure. The tower's response crackled back, granting permission. And then they were moving, taxiing with perfect centerline control, approaching the runway with the kind of confidence that made Vivian's breath catch. The takeoff was flawless. Smooth rotation, optimal climb angle, gear retraction timed precisely. As Manhattan fell away beneath them and they punched through a thin cloud layer into brilliant sunshine, Vivian realized her hands were gripping the armrests. Not from fear, from something else entirely. Something like wonder. Once they reached cruising altitude, she unbuckled and moved to the cockpit doorway. Elias sat surrounded by glowing displays, the autopilot engaged, his hands resting lightly on his thighs. He glanced back at her, and for the first time, she saw something that might have been amusement in his eyes. "Where did you learn to handle a Gulf Stream like that?" she asked. "Let's just say it's been a while since I've crashed," he replied quietly. There was something behind those words. Pain, maybe. History, definitely. But before she could press further, he returned his attention to the instruments, and she recognized the gesture for what it was. A door politely but firmly closed. The flight to Boston took 93 minutes. They landed at Logan International with the kind of precision that made the tower controller compliment them over the radio. Vivian's car was waiting. She made her meeting with 7 minutes to spare. The pitch went perfectly. The investors signed. $2 billion secured. But when she returned to the aircraft 3 hours later, flushed with victory and ready to thank the mysterious janitor who'd somehow saved her company's biggest deal of the year, he was gone. The cockpit was empty. The co-pilot seat perfectly adjusted back to neutral. No note, no explanation, just gone, as if he'd been a figment of her imagination. Vivian stood in the empty aircraft, surrounded by luxury and success, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, genuine confusion, and underneath that, something even more unsettling, curiosity. That night, back in her Manhattan penthouse, she couldn't stop thinking about him. She'd called Marcus from the car, demanding Elias Grant's full employment file. What arrived was disappointing in its mundaneness. Hired 8 months ago. Night maintenance crew. No prior employment listed. No references. Just a social security number and an address in Queens. No prior experience listed, she murmured to herself, staring at the file on her tablet. Then how? She had resources. Connections. A godfather who'd served as a 3-star general in the Air Force before retiring to consult for defense contractors. One phone call. That's all it would take to find out who Elias Grant really was. But something stopped her. Some instinct that told her if she went digging, she'd find something that would make her feel even more ashamed of her cruel joke about marriage, of the way she'd mocked him, of the way she'd treated him like an amusing curiosity rather than a human being. She made the call anyway. Across the city, in a small apartment in Queens, Elias Grant sat on a worn couch watching his 6-year-old daughter sleep. Lily was curled up in her favorite spot, surrounded by model airplanes she'd arranged in careful formations. Her dark curls fell across her face, and even in sleep she smiled slightly, dreaming whatever beautiful dreams children dream. The apartment was clean but sparse. Second-hand furniture, no television, books lining makeshift shelves made from cinder blocks and planks. On one wall hung a photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a bright smile, frozen forever in a moment of joy. Rachel, his wife, gone 3 years now, taken by cancer that had burned through her as fast and merciless as afterburner. Beside that photo hung another, this one showing a younger Elias in a flight suit, standing in front of an F divided by A-18 Super Hornet, his helmet tucked under one arm, the same calm confidence in his eyes but something lighter in his expression. Something that hadn't survived the year since. Captain Elias Grant, Navy test pilot. Decorated, respected, trusted with experimental aircraft that cost more than small countries' GDP. Until the day a storm caught him and his co-pilot over the Pacific, until he'd made a decision in a split second that had saved the $100 million prototype but cost his co-pilot everything. Mechanical failure. The investigation had concluded. No pilot error. Honorable discharge. Full benefits. None of it mattered. He'd been in command. His co-pilot, his friend, had died while he survived. And then, 6 months later, Rachel's diagnosis. The medical bills. The desperate search for experimental treatments. The slow, agonizing goodbye. Flying had been his life. But it had also taken everything from him. So he'd walked away, found work that required nothing but his hands and his back, and focused on the only thing that mattered anymore, giving Lily a stable life, far from the risks and the memories. Today was the first time he'd touched aircraft controls in 3 years. The moment Vivian Archer had mocked him with that cruel joke about marriage, something had shifted inside him. Not anger, something quieter, a whisper that said, maybe, just maybe, he was tired of hiding. The flight had been like breathing again after years of holding his breath. Every switch, every adjustment, every minute of airtime had felt like coming home. And it terrified him. because coming home meant remembering everything he'd lost, everything he'd failed to protect. Lily stirred, mumbling something about clouds, and Elias pulled a blanket over her shoulders, his hand resting briefly on her head. This was enough. This had to be enough. He had no idea that across the city, Vivian Archer was learning his story from a retired general who spoke with deep respect about a pilot who'd been one of the best before tragedy had grounded him. The next morning, when Vivian arrived at Kennedy Tower, she walked through the building differently. Her eyes scanned maintenance crews with new attention. When she reached her office, she stood at the window overlooking the hangar where, far below, she could see a familiar figure in gray coveralls methodically working on landing gear assemblies. Marcus entered with her morning briefing, but she interrupted him. "The night maintenance crew. Where do they usually work?" "Hangar 3, mostly." "Why?" "I'll be working late tonight. Make sure I'm not disturbed." If Marcus thought this was strange, he was wise enough not to show it. Vivian spent the day in meetings, but her mind kept drifting. By 8 p.m., when the executive floors had emptied and the day shift had gone home, she took the private elevator down to the hangars. Hangar 3 was a massive space filled with aircraft in various states of maintenance. Work lights cast dramatic shadows. The smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid permeated everything. And there, underneath a Bombardier Global 7500, lying on a creeper board with tools spread around him, was Elias. She watched him work for several minutes before speaking. His movements were precise, methodical, the same quality she'd noticed in his flying. He wasn't just fixing things, he was understanding them. "You know," she said finally, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space, "most people who save my company's biggest deal would at least stick around for a thank you." The creeper board rolled out from under the aircraft. Elias sat up, wiping his hands on a rag, unsurprised to see her there. "You had a meeting to get to," he said simply. "I did. Thanks to you." She moved closer, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. "I looked into your background." Something flickered across his face. Not quite fear, more like resignation. "And?" he asked. "Captain Elias Grant, Navy test pilot, 16 years of service, 2 air medals, honorable discharge 3 years ago following the crash of an experimental fighter over the Pacific." She paused. "The investigation cleared you completely. Mechanical failure. They said you saved a $100 million aircraft through exceptional skill." Elias stood, his expression unreadable. "They also said my co-pilot died because I chose to save the plane instead of ejecting when I had the chance." "The report doesn't say that." "The report doesn't have to." His voice was quiet but firm. "I was in command. I made the call. Lieutenant Marcus Webb had a wife and twin daughters. He was 32 years old. And I'm the reason he didn't make it home." The raw honesty of it struck Vivian like a physical blow. She'd spent 3 years building walls around her own grief, her own guilt about her brother's death in one of her company's jets. She recognized the architecture of blame in Elias's words because she'd constructed the same prison for herself. "My brother died in a plane crash," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. 4 years ago. Prototype testing. He was CEO then. I was just VP of operations. He took the test flight himself because that's who he was. Always hands-on. Always proving the product was safe. Her voice remained steady, but something in her eyes betrayed the cost of that steadiness. "The investigation found a flaw in the engine management software. We fixed it, paid the settlements, moved on. But I took over his company, and every day I walk through these hangars wondering if I'm just prolonging something that should have died with him." They stood in the shadowed hangar, 2 people who'd built their lives around different forms of the same grief, seeing each other clearly for the first time. "Why are you working as a janitor?" Vivian asked softly. "Because planes took everything from me," Elias said. "And because they're all I know. So I stay close but not too close. Close enough to remember, far enough to keep my daughter safe from who I used to be." "Your daughter?" "Lily. She's 6. Sleeps surrounded by model planes and asks me every night when I'm going to fly again." His jaw tightened. "I tell her someday. But someday is a lie. I can't risk it. Can't risk her losing me the way I lost everything else." Vivian found herself thinking about the little girl who waited at home for a father too afraid of his own past to reach for his future. She thought about herself, running a company she'd never wanted, living a life built on preventing the vulnerability that came with actually caring. I've spent 3 years staying above everything, she said. Emotion is turbulence. I always tell myself, stay above it and you're safe. She looked at Elias. But maybe we're not meant to stay above it. Maybe we're supposed to fly through it. Something shifted in his expression. A crack in the armor, just like the one forming in hers. Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. Vivian found herself working late more often, taking paths through the facility that happened to pass through Hangar 3. Their conversations began as brief exchanges, professional assessments of aircraft maintenance needs, but they evolved into something else, something real. She learned that Elias read poetry to Lily before bed, that his wife had died of cancer 18 months after his discharge, leaving him alone with a 4-year-old and medical bills that had consumed every penny of his savings, that he'd chosen night maintenance specifically so he could walk Lily to school each morning and be there when she woke from nightmares. He learned that Vivian had never wanted to run Archer Dynamics, that she'd studied music in college before her brother's death had pulled her into the family business, that she kept a piano in her penthouse but hadn't played it in 4 years. That control wasn't strength, it was fear wearing an expensive suit. One night, Vivian arrived at the hangar to find it wasn't just Elias there. A small girl sat in the corner, surrounded by colored pencils and paper, drawing elaborate pictures of jets flying through rainbow clouds. "You must be Lily," Vivian said, crouching down to the child's eye level. Lily looked up with eyes exactly like her father's, curious and calm. "Are you Daddy's boss?" "I suppose I am." "Are you nice to him?" The question was direct, unfiltered by adult politeness. Vivian glanced at Elias, who was watching this interaction with barely concealed concern. "I'm trying to be better," she said honestly. That night, Vivian did something she hadn't done in years. She sat on the hangar floor, ruining a $3,000 suit, and helped a 6-year-old color pictures of airplanes. Lily chattered about her day at school, about the kids in her class, about how her daddy could fix anything but was sad sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. When Lily fell asleep against her father's side, Vivian watched Elias gently lift her, cradling her, with the kind of tenderness that made Vivian's chest ache. She'd spent so long avoiding softness, avoiding vulnerability, that seeing it so unselfconsciously displayed felt like witnessing something sacred. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night 3 weeks after the Boston flight. Vivian had arranged for a maintenance simulator to be tested, one of the advanced flight training systems her company leased to commercial airlines. It needed diagnostics, and she'd specifically asked Elias to handle it. She didn't tell him she'd be watching, didn't mention that the simulator was set to replicate emergency scenarios. She wanted to see how he'd react. She watched through the observation window as he powered up the system, settled into the simulator cockpit, and began running through standard procedures. Everything was fine until the system triggered a scenario: engine failure at altitude and severe weather, exactly like the conditions that had killed his co-pilot. Elias froze. His hands gripped the controls, but he couldn't move. The simulation played out, alarms blaring, artificial instruments showing rapid altitude loss. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His breathing became rapid, shallow. Vivian ran in, killing the simulation with the emergency override. "Elias!" He was shaking, eyes distant, lost somewhere 3 years in the past over the Pacific Ocean. She'd seen panic attacks before, but never in someone who carried themselves with such control. Never in someone so clearly fighting every instinct to just let go. "Look at me," she said, grabbing his shoulders. "You're not there. You're here. You're safe." Slowly, gradually, he came back. When his eyes finally focused on her, they were filled with something like shame. "I can't," he whispered. "I thought I could, but I can't. Every time I close my eyes in a cockpit, I see Marcus ejecting late, see his chute fail to deploy, see the ocean." "You made a decision in impossible circumstances," Vivian said firmly. "You chose to try to save everything instead of just yourself. That's not failure. That's courage." "Courage?" His laugh was bitter. "I've been hiding in hangars for 3 years, too afraid to even sit in a cockpit. What's courageous about that? You're raising a daughter alone. You're working overnight shifts so she never wakes up without you there. You got in my jet with no notice, no preparation, and flew it perfectly because it was the right thing to do." Vivian's voice softened. You're the bravest person I know. You're just too close to your own grief to see it." The words hung between them, honest and raw. And then Elias did something unexpected. He told her everything, the whole story. How the experimental fighter had developed engine trouble 40 minutes into the test flight. How he'd worked frantically to stabilize it while Marcus handled communications. How the storm had appeared faster than meteorology had predicted, surrounding them with turbulence that made the damaged aircraft almost uncontrollable. He described the moment of decision. Eject now and lose the prototype, but guarantee both their safety, or fight to reach clear airspace and save the aircraft. He'd chosen to fight, had believed he could do both, had been wrong. Marcus's ejection seat malfunctioned, Elias said, his voice hollow. When we finally had to punch out, his seat fired but the chute deployment failed. The investigation said it was a manufacturing defect, completely unrelated to the storm or my decisions. But if I'd ejected when I should have, when we were still over calm water at safer altitude, maybe the chute would have worked. Maybe the defect wouldn't have mattered. Maybe he'd still be alive. Vivian listened to all of it, and when he finished, she told him about her brother. About Alexander Archer, who'd been brilliant and reckless and determined to prove their jets were safe by flying them himself. About the test flight that should have been routine. About the moment she'd gotten the call that his plane had gone down in the mountains of Colorado. The software flaw was something our engineers missed, she said. Something I should have caught in quality review. I signed off on those systems, me, and he died because I wasn't thorough enough, wasn't careful enough. So I became the most controlled, most careful, most emotionless CEO in the industry. Because if I never feel anything, I can never miss something important again. They sat in the silent simulator, two people who'd been running from the sky that had defined and destroyed them, finally admitting they were tired of running. "We're a mess," Elias said quietly. "Completely," Vivian agreed. "But maybe that's okay." The moment felt suspended, fragile, like it might shatter if either of them moved too quickly. But before it could develop into something more, Vivian's phone buzzed with an emergency notification. A message from Marcus. NASA contract approved. Prototype demonstration in 3 weeks. They want live flight test with media present. The NASA contract. Archer Dynamics had been developing a high-altitude research aircraft for 2 years, and NASA had finally approved it for atmospheric testing. It would be the company's biggest public demonstration ever. Proof that they'd moved beyond the tragedy of 4 years ago. Proof that Vivian could lead the company into the future. There was just one problem. They needed a pilot with both military test flight experience and the skill to handle an experimental aircraft in front of the world's aerospace media. Vivian looked at Elias, and he immediately shook his head. "No," he said. "Absolutely not. You're the most qualified pilot I have. I'm a janitor who hasn't flown professionally in 3 years, who just proved he can't even handle a simulator without falling apart. You're a decorated test pilot who landed my jet perfectly with no preparation and no warning," Vivian countered. "This is what you were trained for, what you were born for." "I'm done being a pilot," Elias said, standing abruptly. "I got in your jet because you were desperate and I owed you for giving me a job when I had nothing. But I'm not doing this. I can't." He walked out of the simulator, and Vivian didn't follow. She understood. Pushing him now would only drive him further away. But as she sat alone in the cockpit, surrounded by silent instruments, she couldn't shake the feeling that both their redemptions were tied to that NASA flight. The confrontation came 3 days later, but not from Vivian. Her father, Charles Archer, stormed into her office with the fury of a man whose careful corporate image was being threatened. At 68, Charles was everything Vivian had spent her life trying not to become: ruthless, image, obsessed, and convinced that business was war by other means. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, throwing a folder on her desk. Inside were surveillance photos from the hangar, her sitting on the floor with Lily, talking with Elias. The kind of documentation hired by a board member worried about the CEO's judgment. "That's me doing my job," Vivian said calmly. "That's you fraternizing with maintenance staff. There are rumors you're involved with, a janitor, for God's sake. Do you have any idea how that looks?" "I don't particularly care how it looks." Charles slammed his hand on the desk. "You should. The board is already questioning your leadership. The stock took a hit after you personally intervened in that labor dispute last month. You're running this company like a charity, not a business. And now this. Elias Grant is the most qualified test pilot we have for the NASA demonstration. Elias Grant is a washout with PTSD who cleans toilets. Find someone else. Something cold and sharp crystallized in Vivian's chest. He's a decorated veteran who saved your daughter's biggest deal of the year by flying her to Boston when every other pilot was unavailable. And I won't hear him disrespected in my office. Your office? Charles's laugh was cruel. This was Alexander's office. You're just keeping it warm until the board realizes you're not cut out for this. The words hit exactly where he'd intended, but Vivian didn't flinch. Get out. I'm warning you, Vivian. You risk this company's reputation for some broken pilot, and I'll make sure the board removes you, family or not. After he left, Vivian stood at her window for a long time, looking down at the hangars where Elias was probably working, unaware of the corporate warfare happening 60 floors above. Her father had thrown down a gauntlet. Choose the company's image, or choose the people who made it real. For the first time in 3 years, the choice felt easy. She found Elias that night in his usual spot, this time working on hydraulic systems. Lily was there again, her presence now familiar and somehow comforting. The little girl waved enthusiastically. Miss Vivian, look what Daddy taught me. She held up a small wooden model of a plane, clearly handmade, with moving parts. That's beautiful, Vivian said, genuinely impressed. Daddy says if you want to fly planes, first you have to understand them, Lily explained seriously. So we're learning together. Vivian looked at Elias, who was watching his daughter with such pure love that it made everything else seem insignificant. Here was a man who'd lost everything but was still teaching his daughter to reach for the sky. How could anyone call that broken? Can I talk to you? She asked. They walked to a quiet corner of the hangar while Lily continued working on her model. Vivian explained the confrontation with her father, the board's concerns, the pressure to distance herself from him. So, what are you going to do? Elias asked. I'm going to ask you one more time to fly that NASA demonstration, she said. Not for the company, not for the contract, for you. Because Lily asked you when you're going to fly again, and you told her someday. Let someday be now. Elias was quiet for a long moment. You don't understand what you're asking. I don't trust myself up there anymore. What if I freeze? What if I make the wrong call again? What if you don't? Vivian moved closer. What if you get up there and remember that you're one of the best pilots in the world? What if you show your daughter that falling down doesn't mean staying down? And if I crash your prototype in front of NASA and every aerospace journalist in the country, then we'll build another one. Together. The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Together. Not as CEO and employee, not as billionaire and janitor. As two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of their grief and discovered that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild something better. The decision came from an unexpected place. That night, after Vivian had left, Lily sat with her father on the hood of a maintenance cart, eating the dinner he'd packed, looking up at the aircraft suspended in the hangar. Daddy, she said thoughtfully, do you still love the sky? Elias looked at his daughter, this perfect small person who represented everything he'd managed to protect in a world that had taken so much. What makes you ask that? Because you look at the planes the way you look at pictures of Mommy, Lily said with the devastating honesty of children. Like you love them, but they make you sad. He had no answer for that. So Lily continued. Miss Vivian said you're the best pilot she knows, and you told me to always be brave and try new things even when they're scary. But you're not being brave about flying. You're being scared. Out of the mouths of babes came the truth he'd been avoiding. He was scared, terrified, not of the flying itself, but of caring about it again, of letting himself want something beyond mere survival. You're right, he said quietly. I am scared, but you're going to do it anyway, right? Because that's what brave means. Being scared but doing it anyway. Elias looked at his daughter and saw Rachel in her eyes, in her determination, in her absolute faith that her father could do anything. And he made a decision that terrified him more than any test flight ever had. Yes, sweetheart, I'm going to do it anyway. 3 weeks. That's how long Elias had to prepare for the flight. that would either mark his return or confirm every fear he had about himself. Vivian arranged everything. She cleared his maintenance shifts, provided access to simulators, brought in a retired Navy flight instructor who'd known Elias during his service and could help him work through the mental blocks. The instructor, Commander Sarah Chen, was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense. She took one look at Elias and said, "You look like hell, Grant. Good to see you too, Commander." They worked in the simulators every evening. Chen ran him through every scenario, every emergency, every situation that could trigger his trauma. Each time he froze, she'd pause the simulation and make him talk through it. Not the technical response, but the emotional one. "What are you feeling right now?" she'd ask. "Fear. Of what?" "Failing. Making the wrong call. Getting someone killed." "Who?" "I don't know. Anyone. Everyone." Chen would nod. "Good. Now acknowledge that fear and fly anyway. Fear doesn't disqualify you from the cockpit, Grant. Refusing to fly despite the fear is what disqualifies you." Slowly, painfully, he began to work through it. The freezing episodes became shorter, his responses more automatic. The muscle memory of thousands of flight hours, gradually overriding the psychological barriers. Vivian watched many of these sessions from the observation room. She saw him struggle, saw him fail, saw him get up and try again. And somewhere in those weeks, something shifted in how she saw not just Elias, but herself. If he could face his demons, maybe she could face hers. She started playing piano again, just for herself, late at night in her penthouse. Chopin nocturnes that her brother had loved. She cried while playing them, and instead of viewing that as weakness, she recognized it as healing. She also began changing how she ran Archer Dynamics, started attending company events not as the Ice Queen CEO but as a person, learned her employees' names, asked about their families. One of the maintenance supervisors mentioned his son was sick, and Vivian quietly ensured the family had access to the company's best health insurance. The board noticed. So did her father, who viewed these changes with increasing alarm. But Vivian found she no longer cared about managing his expectations. She was too busy becoming who she should have been all along. The day of the NASA demonstration arrived with perfect weather. Clear skies, light winds, ideal visibility. Archer Airfield had been transformed into a media circus. Aerospace journalists from every major publication, NASA officials, potential clients representing governments and corporations, and cameras everywhere, ready to broadcast Archer Dynamics' triumphant return to cutting-edge aviation or spectacular failure. Behind the scenes, Elias stood in the pilot's ready room, staring at his flight suit. Vivian found him there, looking like he might bolt. "You don't have to do this," she said, even though they both knew she didn't mean it. "Yes, I do," he replied. "For Lily. For myself. Maybe even for you. For me? You've been grounded too. Just in a different way. If I can do this, maybe you'll believe you can let go of whatever's been holding you back." Vivian realized he was right. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, his redemption had become tangled with hers. They were both trying to prove they could be more than their grief had made them. "Fly safe," she said. "Always." Outside, Lily sat in the VIP section, wearing a headset that would let her hear the flight communications. Vivian had arranged it, wanting the girl to witness her father's moment. Next to Lily sat Commander Chen, ready to explain everything that would happen. The prototype aircraft was beautiful, sleek, white, with elegant lines that suggested both speed and precision. The X-47 Amperes, designed for high-altitude atmospheric research. It represented 3 years of development and $50 million in investment. Elias walked to it in his flight suit, helmet under his arm, surrounded by cameras and strangers. But his eyes found Lily in the crowd, and she gave him a thumbs up that made him smile. Vivian stood in the mobile flight control center, headset on, surrounded by engineers and NASA observers. She'd positioned herself as flight support, the voice Elias would hear during the demonstration. As he climbed into the cockpit, she activated her mic. "Archer 2, this is flight control. Radio check." His voice came back steady and calm. "Flight control, Archer 2, loud and clear." The pre-flight checks proceeded flawlessly. Systems green across the board. Elias's communications were professional, precise, exactly what they should be. But Vivian could hear something underneath the technical language. Emotion. Not fear, but something like joy. He was coming home. The tower cleared him for takeoff. The X-47 Amperes' engines spooled up with a sound like controlled thunder. Then he was rolling, accelerating, rotating smoothly into the air. The crowd gasped at the grace of it. This wasn't just competent flying. This was artistry. Elias took the prototype through its demonstration profile with absolute precision. Steep climbs showing the engine's power, gentle turns revealing the control surface's responsiveness, a high-speed pass that made the crowd cheer. Everything NASA had requested, executed flawlessly. Vivian watched the telemetry, but more than that, she watched the man. Through the cameras trained on the cockpit, she could see his face. He wasn't just flying, he was free. Flight control. His voice came through her headset, requesting permission for one additional maneuver, not on the flight plan. Vivian hesitated. Stick to the plan, her old self screamed. But her new self, the one he'd helped create, understood what he was asking. Permission to trust himself. Permission to go beyond merely adequate and reach for exceptional. Permission granted, Archer. 2. Show them what you've got. What followed was the most beautiful flying Vivian had ever witnessed. Elias took the X-47 Amperes through a series of aerobatic maneuvers that demonstrated not just the aircraft's capabilities but his own mastery. A barrel roll. A climbing reversal. A low-altitude pass executed with such precision that the NASA officials stood and applauded. In the VIP section, Lily was on her feet, screaming, "That's my dad! That's my dad!" at the top of her lungs. The landing was perfect. As the aircraft rolled to a stop and Elias shut down the engines, the crowd erupted. Media swarmed. NASA officials rushed to inspect the aircraft. It was pandemonium of the best kind. But Elias didn't climb out immediately. He sat in the cockpit, and Vivian could see on the camera feed that he was crying. Not from sadness, from release. From finally forgiving himself enough to reclaim who he'd always been. When he finally emerged, the first person to reach him was Lily, who'd broken through every security protocol to run to her father. He caught her up in his arms, holding her tight while cameras flashed around them. "I knew you could do it," she shouted. "I knew it." "So did I," he whispered just for her. "Thanks to you." Vivian watched from the control center, her own eyes wet. The NASA contract was secure. The company's reputation was restored. But none of that mattered as much as seeing the man she'd come to care for finally step back into the light. The celebration lasted hours. Press interviews. Congratulations from NASA. Charles Archer himself appeared, forced to publicly praise the demonstration while privately seething. Vivian handled it all with grace, but her eyes kept finding Elias in the crowd. Later, when the official events had ended and the media had finally dispersed, she found him alone by the hangar lights. Lily was with Commander Chen, who'd promised to take her for ice cream and regale her with stories of her father's Navy days. "You did it," Vivian said, approaching. "We did it," Elias corrected. "You gave me a reason to try." They stood in the warm evening air, the last light of sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The same sky that had taken so much from both of them. The same sky that had, somehow, brought them together. "I never meant it, you know," Vivian said quietly. "That day in my office, when I said I'd marry you if you flew the jet, it was cruel. I was mocking you." "I know," Elias said, "but maybe I can make you mean it now." He pulled something from his pocket, a small box. Inside was a ring, simple and elegant, with a tiny engraved wing on the band. Vivian's breath caught. "Elias, you helped me remember who I was," he said, kneeling on the tarmac in his flight suit. This man who'd gone from janitor to hero in the span of a single afternoon. "Let me help you forget who you were afraid to be. Marry me." Not because of some mocking challenge, but because somewhere in all this mess, I fell in love with you. Every logical part of Vivian's brain screamed that this was too fast, too dramatic, too risky. But logic had kept her frozen for 3 years. Logic had built walls that protected nothing and imprisoned everything. So she did something completely illogical. She said yes. Lily's scream of joy came from behind them, followed by Commander Chen's knowing laugh. They'd been watching, of course. Vivian didn't care. She pulled Elias to his feet and kissed him while the sun set over the airfield, and the jets that had broken them both bore silent witness to their healing. 6 months later, they were married in a small ceremony on the Archer airfield runway. Lily served as flower girl, throwing petals while wearing a junior flight suit. Commander Chen officiated. The guest list was small. People who mattered, not people who looked good in photos. Vivian wore a simple white dress and her brother's watch. Elias wore his navy dress uniform, the medals he'd never wanted to display again now, worn with quiet pride. When they exchanged vows, they promised not to love each other despite their scars, but because of them. Because scars meant survival, meant healing, meant they were brave enough to risk being broken again. The reception was held in Hangar 3, the same place they'd first really talked. Maintenance crews mingled with executives. Vivian's father attended, silent and disapproving, but present. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt, and Vivian had made peace with that. The first dance was to a song Vivian played herself, a Chopin nocturne performed on a piano, moved into the hangar specifically for the occasion. She played while Elias held Lily, swaying gently, and when the music ended, employees who'd never heard their CEO play anything but hardball gave her a standing ovation. Elias returned to test flying, becoming Archer Dynamics' chief test pilot and eventually VP of flight operations. He brought a culture of safety and humanity to the role, remembering that every aircraft carried not just technology, but trust. Vivian continued to run the company, but differently, with more heart, with more flexibility, with the understanding that control wasn't the same as strength. The board initially resisted her changes, but when employee satisfaction rose and innovation increased, even the skeptics had to admit she'd found a better way. Lily grew up surrounded by aircraft and love, never doubting that both her father and stepmother would move mountains for her. She started taking flight lessons on her 12th birthday, and surprised no one when she announced her intention to become an aerospace engineer. The final scene of their story took place 2 years after the wedding, on a Saturday morning in early autumn. The three of them stood on the tarmac beside a small Cessna, preparing for a family flight. "Where to?" Vivian asked as they settled into their seats, Elias in the pilot's position, Vivian beside him, Lily in back with her latest model airplane project. Elias looked at his wife, this brilliant woman who'd given him permission to fly again, and then at his daughter, who'd given him a reason to. He fired up the engine, felt the familiar vibration of an aircraft coming to life, and smiled. "Anywhere," he said, "as long as we're flying together." The little Cessna lifted off smoothly, climbing into a perfect blue sky. From the ground, it would have looked like any other weekend flight. But inside that aircraft were 3 people who'd learned the hardest lesson the sky could teach, that falling wasn't the end. That sometimes you had to hit the ground before you could understand what it meant to truly fly. The sky wasn't their limit. It was their home. And home, they discovered, wasn't a place. It was whoever you chose to fly with. If this story of second chances, redemption, and unexpected love moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your dreams. And drop a comment below telling us your own story of overcoming fear to reach for something greater. What's the one thing you'd do if you weren't afraid? Let us know. And remember, the best time to start flying again is always now.